what are the main issues you're dealing with?
There's a number of main issues right now. In fact, we're in the middle of planning for a pretty major event that we have every couple of years in Ottawa. This year it's for youth. It's called the There are a lot of people who are suffering, and now one of the legitimate and legal responses to that is, well, we can just end it by ending your life instead of treating the symptoms. Markus loved sitting in the hot tub. And one time we were sitting in there and he was talking about, he's like, when I get to buy a house, I want to buy a house out in like Agassiz, Rosedale. I said, oh, why? He said, I just love looking at Mount Chem. That's so fun. And then I said to him, I'm like, you know, son, that might be that you don't ever come to this point in your life.
Have you thought or asked God, like, couldn't you have taught me this in a way that made me not lose my son? How did you move forward? Welcome back, guys, to another episode of the Furious the Curious Show, episode 25. I'm here with Mike Schouten from ARPA. Excited to chat with him. Before we get started, today's sponsor is Furiously Curious Coaching. So that's my coaching company. I help business owners be successful without sacrificing faith, family, and free time. So if you're dealing with one more email, one more sale, one more business deal, and it's just you never have enough time for your family, for the things that are most important to you, I think I can help you with that. So it's very much my own story. Now I do help other guys with that and coach them. And so if you're interested in that, shoot me a text, 604-703-9045. Just shoot me the word interested. Text me the word interested and we'll set up a call and see if it's a good fit or not. But yeah, coaching's really cool because it's not like consulting. Consultants have all the answers. Coaches have all the questions. And so I'm not giving my opinions. I don't know how to run your business better than you do. But through questions, you will get clarity so you can move forward quickly. So if you're interested in that, you can also find out more at furiouslycurious.co. So with that, Mike, thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Kyle. I'm glad to be, it sounds like one of the first people you've had in here with the new backdrop.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. I just finished this yesterday. So
yeah, that's cool.
Pumped to use it. Hopefully you guys like it as well. So you are the director or CEO of ARPA?
The official title is Executive Director.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is ARPA?
So ARPA, acronym, obviously, stands for the Association for Reform Political Action Canada. So essentially, we are an organization with a two-part mission. We always describe it in two parts. The first is to educate, equip, and encourage Christians, Reformed Christians, to political action. So coming alongside Christians, helping them to understand the issues of the day, inspiring them that they can actually do things to make a change, and then trying to provide them with the tools to make that change. So for example, if someone wants to meet with their MP to talk about something on their heart, it could be a public policy issue, it could be something going on in their personal life, et cetera. They need some assistance from the government. How do you do that? How do you even set up a meeting? Just working alongside them as they do that. And then the second part of our mission is to take a biblical perspective directly to our civil authorities. So that's the intervening in court cases, meeting directly with politicians at all levels of government in the form of what we call direct advocacy kind of work. So putting together, a one-pager that outlines a problem and then also walks through some potential solutions, and then, asking them to consider that or if they would be in support of said solution, that type of work. So we do a lot of that from our head office in Ottawa. We have an office in Ottawa just a few blocks from Parliament Hill. Okay. So a lot of that advocacy work happens there. And then at the provincial level, we have people working in provinces throughout the country. So we're quite spread out. We have 14 staff right now who do that work. So that gives you, I think if people were to ask me like, okay, what's the pitch from floor 3 to floor 5 in the elevator? It's like, we're a Christian advocacy, political advocacy organization that comes alongside Christians to help them engage in politics today.
Okay. And what kind of issues in politics, like what are the main issues you're dealing with?
Yeah, good question. There's a number of main issues right now. In fact, we're in the middle of planning for a pretty major event that we have every couple of years in Ottawa. This year it's for youth. It's called the God and Government Youth Conference. We have about 36 youth from across the country coming, and the three issues that we've prepared them to speak to senators and MPs on are pornography, euthanasia, and preborn human rights. So those, I would say, I'd probably add in there transgender ideology and how that's impacting schools and education systems across the country, how that's impacting life in general. It seems to permeate every aspect of life right now. But yeah, those, if you would put them into broader topics, it would be like life, so euthanasia and abortion, gender and sexuality. So that would cover things like pornography, transgender ideology, medical transitioning for minors, things like that. And then another big one is freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. And that manifests
freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech, yeah. So that manifests in numerous ways. For example, freedom of speech, you mentioned that one. It's a good one because often what we're seeing in society and in culture today is that when people don't like something you're saying and they don't have a rational argument against it, they try to just censor you. Like that's their default, like just shut them up, right? So we actually recently, last year, we had a court case that we had launched in the city of St. Catharines, Ontario. So what's happening more and more is municipalities are taking it upon themselves to implement bylaws usually that censor people's speech. So in this case, they passed a bylaw that prohibited the distribution of any materials that had a fetal image on it. So we use quite a bit of that, not in the graphic abortion victim photography, but ultrasound images, even sketches of fetuses. We use that to help bolster our message that we're bringing. So that's on many of our brochures and pamphlets that we deliver in neighborhoods. So obviously it had an impact on the work that we do. We don't very often initiate legal action. I think the other thing people should know about ARPA Canada is that we have a very high regard for those in authority over us and God's call for us to respect them and obey them. But in this case, we deemed it, in a very respectful manner, we ought to initiate this legal action. So we filed court action against the city of St. Catharines, said this bylaw you passed is unconstitutional because it prohibits free speech. And, our law and policy team went through about 3 months of work preparing the arguments. Obviously, the arguments get shared by both parties. And about 3 weeks before the case was supposed to go to court, the city of St. Catharines met the mayor and the councillors, and then upon the legal advice from their own lawyers, they repealed their own bylaw. Okay. So it didn't set a legal precedent, it didn't make it into the court, but it set a political precedent that you can't just try to censor people that you don't, just because you disagree with their opinion. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So yeah, that's a pretty big one as well.
Okay. So I want to back up a bit. How did you get into this in the first place?
Oh, that's a long story. I won't give you every single detail of it, but my background actually is in horticulture.
Okay.
So it's great living out here in Chilliwack. There's lots of greenhouses and growing and so on. But predominantly my career was actually in Surrey, BC. So more towards Metro Vancouver. I worked at a big greenhouse outfit there and enjoyed it. Had a great job. My wife and I still love growing. Gardening's our passion. We grow a lot of our own food. But it was probably around the mid-2000s, so 2003, 2004, when we relocated there for that work. And at that time, we were part of a new church community, didn't know a lot of people. And I vividly remember it one evening, my wife, Jennifer, she said, I think I saw in the bulletin, there's some kind of like ARPA event at the church tonight. Maybe we should just go there and meet some people. So I was like, oh, sure. I took that encouragement and I went to that meeting. There was 5 or 6 people there and they had a speaker in and it was quite all official and everything. They explained what they do and the speaker gave a little talk. And then at the end, they had to do like what they called, I think, like general business. So this was a local ARPA chapter that had hosted this meeting. And it was the first I'd ever heard of them. But at the end, they had to do their general business and it turned out they needed a new board member. So there was hardly any people in the room. And one of the people there said, would you be willing to stand for that? I said, I don't know much about this, but it looks like you need some help. So sure, I'll put my name forward, and somebody else did. And then it was a tie. It was a tie between us. So they checked their constitution or whatever. They had a constitution. They're like, oh, it says if it's a tie, it goes to the one who's older. So and I was just a little bit older than the other person.
Okay.
So I came home and I said to Jennifer, I'm like, oh, I said, good evening. And I'm on the board of this ARPA thing. So that really, I think that's where, God used that to kind of to bend my path, if you will. Grew in me an interest and a passion for politics. We did a lot of, at that time, and this was actually prior to, and we might get to this later, but prior to ARPA Canada even being anything. Like there was no ARPA Canada. There was just these little chapters across the country, people volunteering to work with the people in their church communities and so on. But at that time in Surrey, like a huge issue was casinos, the opening up of casinos. There's a big horse track in Surrey and they wanted to add a casino to it. So we would do presentations to the city council on, the harms of casinos and what they can bring to a community. We started to meet with our federal politicians. At that time, the Canadian Alliance was joining with the Progressive Conservatives to become what now is the Conservative Party. So we were meeting with prospective candidates and sharing who we were. And
this was a part-time thing for you at
the time? It was all part-time.
Okay.
So I'm working in the greenhouse and we're kind of doing this. I often refer to as people that kind of like weekend warrior type of politics, right? And then, so that was happening and I could feel that God was doing something in my life. And it probably manifested the most when he used other people to kind of encourage me in a certain direction. So that was happening. And then at the same time, our pastor at our local church, he was off for a while. So I was an elder at that time. So I got asked to lead worship services. And I had never done public speaking in my life before that. I can remember going to the church on a Saturday night and preaching the sermon to my wife, Jennifer, so she could give me feedback, just and I could get over the nerves of doing that. And that went well, and people encouraged me to do more public speaking. And then I went to Toastmasters, and that all just was all happening at the same time as being involved in politics. And then in 2008, again, my wife Jennifer and I and a bunch of other people were at a coffee meeting with our incumbent MP. It was an election. We were in an election period, and he was having one of these coffee socials, just trying to build support and have a bit of a more tighter knit conversation. And I remember asking him at that time, so this is 2008, Conservatives have a minority and they want a majority. That's what they were after. And I said, if you get elected again, what is your government going to do about the fact that we have no abortion law in our country? Like since 1988, we have had no protection for preborn children. And he in the context of that living room, he said, nothing. Like we're not going to do anything. Prime Minister Harper has committed. We're not going to pass an abortion law. We're not touching that issue. And this was like a solid pro-life candidate that we had helped get elected numerous times. And we left that coffee meeting. I said to Jennifer, I said, it feels like this is like the last time I want to vote Conservative. Like I'm just so disenfranchised with this. But I didn't know what to do. I'm like, what's the alternative, right? And so I started sharing this with some of my friends, my frustrations. And then somebody said to me at one point in that journey, they said, have you ever heard of the Christian Heritage Party? I was like, no, I've never heard of the Christian Heritage Party. So they introduced me to it. One thing led to another. And in 2011, the next federal election, I ran against that same candidate as a Christian Heritage Party candidate. Okay. So I took, the election campaign was 5 weeks long. So I took 2.5 weeks off of work at the greenhouse and I used it every afternoon for 5 weeks straight. So I would go to the greenhouse 6 a.m., work till lunch, come home, put some nicer clothes on, go door knocking, get prepared for all candidates, debates, all that kind of stuff. We had signs throughout the riding. It was a hoot. It was so fun. Okay. A lot of people got on board and just really thoroughly enjoyed myself and also enjoyed that we could make abortion an election issue in that riding. Yeah. Because that's what I ran on that platform. Yeah. Like Canada needs an abortion law. And the person that I ran against, we're still friends today. Like it was just he welcomed that in the sense that he was kind of forced to talk about it because I was bringing it up, right? So it was a good thing. I only got like 450 votes or whatever. Like that didn't come anywhere close to winning. And then after that, so this is May 2011, we had just had our 6th child.
And so you probably knew you weren't going to win, but you did it anyway. What was the motivation? Just to bring the issue to light?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I think if I look back, it was quite a long time ago, but it was just principally, I was like, I can't vote for a party that keeps saying, like, yeah, we know that's happening, but we're not going to do anything about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was just a lot of fun. Like you said, we knew that we probably weren't going to win, but we ran like we were going to win.
Yeah.
And so that was May 2011. And then after that, I just went back to work in the greenhouse. I'm like, okay, that was good. Not sure what God's going to put on my path next. And then in November of that same year, the executive director at the time, the author of this book that I gave you, Our God Moves Mountains, Mark Penninga, so I knew him, and he had helped a little bit on my election campaign. He just out of the blue emailed me, and he said, hey, do you want to go out for dinner tonight? Like, I was like, well, that's pretty quick. Like, what's up, And he said, I have something, an idea I want to run past you. And he said to me, would you be willing to actually work full-time in the pro-life movement? And it quite took me by surprise. I was like, how do you work in the pro-life movement? Like, I work in a greenhouse. I'm used to, you grow plants, you sell them, you make money, you pay for the costs, and you take home some, right? Yeah. How do you do that? And he said, there's a group of people who are willing to fund an employee for a year to see where we can go with this. And I said, well, what is this? Like, what are you talking about? And then that's what really started in me this fire to actually alter the paradigm in the pro-life movement from an all or nothing type of political strategy, where the only law that they would propose or support would be a law that banned all abortions, full stop. To shift that to a paradigm where people accepted that, yeah, that's where we might want to go, but it's going to take a lot of steps to get there. We need to find a way to work incrementally and to try to build support with what Canadians might have in common already, right? Like, so what's Canadians' perspectives of late-term abortion or sex-selective abortion, those kind of things. So it took us quite a few months, probably 2 months, Jennifer and I, to say yes to that opportunity. But in the end, it felt like, and you probably had this before in your life, where it's like God opens a door in front of you, and it almost feels like if you don't walk through it, you feel like you're saying no to God. And yeah, it really felt like that. And so through prayer and deliberation, we said yes. And one of the key moments in that was someone who's a really good mentor and friend today, John Hoff, a good, solid Catholic guy out in Langley. He met with me for coffee, and he was working full-time in the pro-life movement. And he said to me, Mike, I want to share with you something that someone shared with me. It was like 20 years prior to that. He was working at Safeway, and he had the opportunity to work full-time in the pro-life movement. And he said, they said to me at that time, and I'm going to say this to you now, there's far more people in Canada today working full-time to take the lives of preborn children than there are working to save the lives of preborn children. And that really had an impression on me. Like, that was, I think, one of the things that, it really encouraged us to say yes to that opportunity. So yeah, that journey started in March of 2012. And at that time, it was basically building something from the ground up. And that's now the We Need a Law campaign.
Okay. So you were the first full-time employee for ARPA?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, not first-time employee. So Mark Penninga had founded it in 2007. Yeah. So he was working for them. And then they had hired another colleague of ours had started about 6 months prior to me. And he worked from Ottawa. He's a lawyer. So worked on a lot of the legal cases and did a lot of the public presentations for ARPA Canada.
Okay. And has it grown since you came on board?
Yeah, it certainly has. So I was the third employee, and today we have 14 staff, so 12 full-time and 2 part-time. And there's a number here in BC. There's one in Alberta, and then we have a few staff at a Southern Ontario office, and then the rest of the staff work out of our Ottawa office. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to get to some of the issues that you're fighting today and some of the questions around that, but I want to back up even more first.
Sure.
What's your motivation for this? Like, why are you pro-life? How did you become a Christian? Like, why do these things matter to you in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that there was no one particular moment where I was like, oh, I'm pro-life and this is meaningful. I think throughout my childhood, I remember my parents going to rallies and so on. So this is back in the 80s when Henry Morgentaler was challenging Canada's abortion laws. So that kind of thing was happening, but it wasn't, I wouldn't say our family was a huge like pro-life family that we were always rallying and so on. I think it more had to do with a sense of justice, in the sense that when you consider, the most vulnerable people in a society and how we're caring for them, and we can talk about that later about euthanasia and society's response to suffering, but preborn children are among the most helpless, and where they are as they grow in their mother's womb should be the safest place on earth. It shouldn't be a place where, one human being can decide that human being's life is worthless and end it. So a sense of justice, but then I think that coupled with really a passion and understanding for politics itself. Like there's a lot of people, a lot of Christians who have a complete disdain for politics. Like they're like, it's just dirty work. You always have to compromise. It seems to take forever to get anywhere. So that's all true. But I think God has given me a posture to welcome that, to embrace that, and to work with it. So through the 2000s and all that weekend warrior type of work that we were doing, I think I developed a good understanding of how can you maintain a principled type of pluralism, if you will, like principled pragmatism almost, like where, there is pragmatism, but you can hold to your principles and still try to advance God's truth in the public square.
Yeah.
There are ways to do that. And I think that ARPA is an example of a way to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your own faith journey, how did you come to become a Christian?
So I was born into a Christian home in the Reformed community, grew up in the Canadian Reformed Church, where, obviously doctrine is very important. I think that making our faith our own is an area where we're constantly trying to reform in. I think the Reformed Church is not just reformed and always reformed, like they're reforming, like there's an opportunity for sanctification amongst the church itself at large. I would say for myself, my wife and I got married young, 20 years old. We had 3 kids in 5 years. And then we moved from Greendale. We lived in Greendale. That's where we started to Surrey, where I worked at that greenhouse. And that move to that new church community, I think was a catalyst for just really making it my own, making my faith my own and being on our own.
Maybe you got clarity on who Christ was, or like you seen more of your own sin, or what was it that made what gave the clarity? Or what made it more your own?
So I think it was a combination of those things, but seeing it in others. Like, so the friend group that we, embraced us really when we moved there, because at the time, a lot of people were like, not just in Christian community, but in communities were moving out of those areas to this way, Abbotsford, Chilliwack, and we went back. So they embraced us. We were expecting our 4th child at that time, Markus, and it was just the group of friends that we became part of where it was like, oh, I can be excited about Jesus Christ as my Savior. We can do Bible study together and sharpen each other, and then go for a beer after and still sharpen each other. Yeah. It was, I think, a lot of their input that just forced me, Jennifer, and I to be like, oh, yeah, we're our own family, and we need to have purpose in raising our kids. And that purpose is that Jesus is at the center of their life. That's what has to be part of this household. So I think that was definitely very formative in my faith journey. Yeah.
Do you remember in those earlier years, in your early 20s or in your teens, were there certain people that were really influential in your life that had a big impact, that kind of shaped your path and what you believed were how to live out your life? And
there certainly were. I think when we moved to Cloverdale, maybe that's part of it as well. Now that you ask that question, just thinking about some of the mentors we had. So there were couples there, good friends of ours still today, Harris and Frida, that they were like, I think, bigger than they thought they were in our lives. Like for Jennifer and I, just really look up to them. They were, half a generation older than us, so their kids were teenagers when ours were toddlers, and they just took us under their wing and really encouraged us to develop our gifts and skills, encouraged us to live Christ-like and have Jesus at the center of our lives, and did that. And then I think part of it actually was the influence of Jennifer on our relationship. And yeah, her family and her parents really inculcated in her and her siblings to live rightly, not based on rules and doctrine, but to live it out, to be excited about who we are as God's people, to share that and show that in all that we do. And I think that she's really brought that into our family, and I just love that about her and her parents.
Yeah. When you initially answered the question, saying, well, the church is always reforming, or Reformed churches need to reform more. Why did you answer that way? Is there something that you feel like that's happening in the church as a whole? I mean, you see all kinds of churches in the work you do and stuff like that. Like, what made you answer that way? Is there something in particular you're thinking of, or?
Yeah. I think right now we go to the Canadian Reformed Church in Yarrow, and there's often conversations about not necessarily like, hey, let's have a conversation about the need to continue to reform, but wrestling with, for example, the purpose of the youth in the church and how do we use their skills and gifts and foster that when it comes to, I think certain habits amongst what oftentimes people will look at the Reformed community and say, oh yeah, they're great at following the rules and going to church on Sunday with their suit and tie on. But the way they did business here, or the way they acted there at that sporting event, or the parties they have, do those characterize, or do they characterize, someone who's following Jesus Christ, and are they Christ-like? And this isn't to paint them with a brush like, oh, that's how they are. But I think that just to give you an indication, like there's a lot of wrestling with, hey, we have to grow in the consistency between what we confess, Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, and how we act, how we respond day to day, knowing who we are. And I think that's been refreshing in a sense. Not that I'm there at all. I need sanctification all the time too. Yeah. But I think as local church communities also need to look at themselves and be like, how can we be sanctified? How can we more and more mirror Christ to our community, especially in a tight-knit community like Yarrow, right, where it's pretty important.
So I also have Reformed background.
Okay.
One of the struggles I've had myself in the advocacy work that happens with ARPA or CCBR or more of those organizations that are fighting for the causes of the unborn or marriage or the values, the Christian values that we hold, is that those get more focus than people's souls. And so you have groups of young people or older people that get really passionate about abortion, really passionate about these kind of issues, but they never share the gospel with their neighbors. They never push to know Christ more. And that's almost missing. Like they care about people for 80 years, but not for the next 800 million years, which is eternity.
Yeah.
And I think it can feel good as well to do this work without, because you feel like you're making a difference, it gives you a sense of purpose, but we're missing the greater purpose of the Great Commission. But I also think that people need to still do this work, right? You can't just say, we're not going to do any of this advocacy work anymore. But I think I believe it needs to be in the right order.
Yeah.
How do you think through that, and how do you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, I think that you've identified a very real threat, if you will, to being involved in this kind of work. Because quite frankly, I do know lots of even Reformed people who almost like live as though it is, you are saved by works, and it's these good works that are going to get you places. So it's quite fascinating, actually, even to have conversations with people and as to the motivation. I think that's what you're getting at. Like, what's your motivation for doing this work? So it's something that probably hardly a day goes by where I don't think about, is it this work like with ARPA that we should be doing? Or what if we took our budget, like our budget's just under 2 million and 14 staff, as I said earlier, and they all just became urban missionaries in the cities they live in? Like, why would we not do that? Like, that seems to be a more importance. But then I always have to remind myself that it's not either or, it's both and. And I think that personally, I've experienced a lot of growth in how that works. And maybe we'll get to this later, but we have our own personal journey that God led us through that taught us a lot of life lessons.
Referring to the passing of your son?
Yeah. But as an organization as well, to understand that it is both and, that when we're meeting with a politician or writing a policy document, that part of the message that has to come through with that is not just like, here's a policy fix, but the message of the gospel needs to come through that, so that whoever's reading it, whether it's a staff member, whether it's a lawyer on the other side of the table or a judge, that they need to understand what's motivating us. Like, what's the why of ARPA? Like, why are we doing this work? And it's really, and this is in our vision statement, that we do this work out of love for God and neighbor. That's why we do this work. That's what motivates us. And there are opportunities where you're only working with neighbor then, whether it be judge, lawyer, member of parliament, etc., on a specific nuance of a policy. But we kid ourselves if we don't think that other people are viewing that or reading that or watching that are thinking about it with the eternal perspective. And that's what we're reminded of ourselves, to always try to bring that out, the eternal perspective.
Yeah.
Because, you're right. Like, we're not just on this journey for 80 years. Like, we're going towards the heavenly Jerusalem, as John talks about in Revelations, right? Like that, we have this eternal destination, and what we do here matters there. Like we have to see that connection, that continuity in life. So, I've really it's a good question, because it, like I said, is something I think about every day. And there's some days where it's stronger, where I'm like, you know what, bags to all this politics stuff. Like let me just go talk to my 20 neighbors and just keep building on what we built there and put more effort into that.
Yeah.
Abraham Kuyper, famous Reformed theologian, he once said that, I'll paraphrase it, but there is not a square inch of all of creation where Christ does not cry, mine. Like, it's all his. So it all has to be redeemed. So we can't, as Christians, abdicate ourselves from certain parts of society and culture just because we don't like them. It all has to have the influence of Jesus Christ, right? Think of the letter to the exiles Jeremiah wrote, Jeremiah 29, where he said, for its welfare is bound up in your welfare. And he's encouraging the Israelites who were in exile in Babylon, in a place that was so foreign to what they had known and become comfortable with, that they would have just wanted to hide under a rock and be over with. But no, Jeremiah says to them, no, you get involved in the affairs of the city, because its welfare is bound up in your welfare. So we do need to be involved. We need to be involved in politics. We need to be involved in business and commerce. We need to be involved in the social safety net of society. I think of things like Safe Families and Cyrus Center here in Chilliwack, and these Ruth and Naomi's. Like, we need to be involved in all these areas, bringing Christ's light into that and shining that into all those arenas. Yeah.
Okay, there's my next question, that we are called to speak truth in love.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's common among Christians that we speak the truth and we forget the love.
Mm-hmm.
You see that on social media, just how Trudeau gets talked about by many Christians. Obviously someone that vehemently disagree with and feel like he's running the country in a very, very bad way. But just like how we talk about him, or that it becomes more about winning the issue, and getting Canada back to where it used to be, and for forgetting that there's we love these people the same way that Christ did. Christ was accused of being a friend of sinners. Are we getting accused of being a friend of sinners? How do you, as you do this work, how do you speak about it to the churches and crowds that you talk to, that you try to motivate to do this in a way where it's not just fighting for the truth and just not just fighting for getting Canada back to where it used to be, but that there's a real affection for Christ and God, and that's what's driving it.
No, it's this is really good, because it's part of, I think I would say, where as an organization, ARPA Canada can continually improve on, But I think it is something that sets us apart from a lot of other political groups or advocacy organizations across the country. Something we say in almost every presentation that we give is ARPA Canada believes in relationships first, policy second. And we remind all our supporters of that. We remind ourselves of that, because ultimately it's about the relationship that we have and the trust that we can build between each other. Even if we might be on, different sides of an issue, we can still have that trust before we bring the issue forward, right? So for example, I can go to Ottawa and have meetings with some Liberal, Green, NDP MPs on certain topics, and we might have complete disagreement on all kinds of things. But because of the way that the message is presented and the tone, out of love, like you said, they're willing to connect with us, and we can debate on these things. So I think that that's what's beautiful about it, because you're right. I think that, and this was especially noticed during COVID and the years following COVID, how, many religious people of faith became very good at sharing truth, but almost like using it as a blunt force instrument without the love. And I think that I like to think that we learned through COVID how to disagree better, but I'm not so sure sometimes if we have. I think that that's what sets us apart, because we're always focused on relationships first. And that, in fact, is what not just we as staff, but when we speak and work alongside those chapters or individuals who are engaged in this work, it's like, no, even if your MP is NDP, you can't just dismiss that. That's somebody that God has put in place over you, and that man or that woman, you need to build a relationship with them. And to do that, you don't come and bop them over the head with the truth. To do that, you come there and just introduce yourself, thank them for serving as your member of parliament, share a bit about yourself, ask them about their self, right? Be invested in their lives, building that relationship, because then when 6 months, 12 months, 2 years down the road, there comes a specific bill or a matter, you can go up to that member of parliament and request a meeting, and they're going to be like, oh yeah, that's that person. Yeah, they're Christian, but man, we had a great conversation. I'll meet with them. And then you can sit down and share some concerns you might have about said law or policy or bill that's being debated at that time. Yeah. Right. So it's always the relationships first, policy second.
And why do you think this problem exists in the first place? Like, is it that Christian communities are not going out into the world, and when everyone thinks the same, no one thinks at all, and you're just isolated in your pockets, and so when you meet someone that's not the same, you just don't know how to engage? Or is it maybe social media? Like, why do you think because I think it happens a lot. If you look at social media for any length of time, and you see what people are posting, like how do we get to this spot? Like, why do you think that church as a whole is in this spot where there seems to be so much like anger, resentment towards the government, towards the media, which I myself feel, and I'll get to that. But why are we here? Mm-hmm. Any ideas on that?
Well, so you packed a lot into that that question. I think that I'm not so sure that it's only Christians or the church who, if getting back to what you said earlier about sharing truth without love, can be
certainly a lot of other
that.
people are doing as well, but we are called specifically to not be that way, and it still seems to be a lot of the church. I mean, it shows how the church is broken and sinful, mm-hmm. and needs Christ. It's not a museum for good people; it's a hospital for the broken. But mm-hmm. It still seems to be just very prevalent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that Christians can, maybe if we just stick with that, like their response, they can be of the opinion that they have the moral high ground, so they can share truth, and excuse me, because they share it, it's going to have a positive impact, right? Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't really wrestled with why we think that. I mean, ultimately, I think a big part of the answer is pride, because you think you have truth on your side, you're right, and no one else is going to dissuade you from that. Yeah. And just by sharing that truth, it better have the desired effect. Yeah. I think that is, but maybe ultimately there's other components as well. Where do we really love our neighbor, right? Like, or are we just concerned about being right and being recognized as being right? Because if we really loved our neighbor, whether that's your MP, MLA, neighbor, whoever, who might be unsaved, do we really love them to the point where we're going to invest in building a relationship with them for the purposes of bringing the gospel into those conversations? Mm-hmm. So I think that's a question that people should ask. But I think that the whole aspect of Christians just sharing truth or being brash, like you said, I don't pay too much attention to social media, mostly because of that. It gets so frustrating, and you can't actually have reasoned dialogue on social media. It doesn't really work. I would say though that it's not good when you do see that. Like, it's not. It's stronger. I think of a stronger way to say this, but it's like, it's not only not healthy, it's like detrimental to the growth of the church. It's detrimental to us being image bearers of Christ.
And to the cause as a whole, because the cause is less effective.
The cause of the church, the cause of the cause of Christian organizations like ARPA, if that's how we're characterized, like, we actually do a disservice to the name of Jesus when we act that way in the public square. Yeah. Like, it's not healthy at all.
Yeah. Okay, going back to politics. So I have loved politics since I was a little kid. I was reading the newspaper when I was 9. I was terrible in school, but every morning I'd read the newspaper and always been super interested in it. And I've really got into it. But the last probably 5 years, maybe since COVID, I've really just felt turned off by it and the fight to change things in Canada, just because it seems like it's so far gone, and that the likelihood of change actually happening is just non-existent. And if you look at the Conservative Party today, it's the Liberal Party in the early 2000s and what they stand for, and the provinces in Canada, the same thing. There's just very little. I feel like hope. It just feels so bleak. And the media in Canada, I feel, at least from my perspective, is extremely one-sided and lies a lot, and I think has a huge influence even on the Christians in Canada on what's actually happening in the government and in politics. And so I've found myself just kind of retreating and just being like, well, I'm just gonna not listen to the news as much anymore, not watch it. It doesn't really make a difference. I know there's this thing called ARPA out there. I know they do their thing, and kind of like wish them well, but don't really feel it's going to make any difference. And I don't think that sentiment is that unique. I see more of it with the people I talk to and people around my age. And do you see that as well? And what would you say to that? Like, what would you say to me in sense of, well, I know it's of course partly in the fact that I'm putting my hope in a government or people changing rather than asking God to change things. But what's your thoughts on that?
Well, so you said that you've really developed those kind of thoughts post-COVID, it sounds like, or through COVID and then after COVID. I would say in our experience, there was a lot of Christians who had a similar kind of disengagement from politics, not a dislike for it, but just they're not interested. They're sort of apathetic towards it, indifferent even prior to COVID, right. Where a lot of our work still at that time was trying to convince Christians that, no, like it's important that Christians are involved in this part of society as well. When COVID happened, whether you like politics or not, or apathetic about it or not, it kind of came right into everyone's living room, right? Like everybody had to be involved in politics because politics came to them. Part of the challenge now is, and that's where it gets into some of the, you talk about social media and its usage and so on. Part of the challenge now is how to channel that energy in a right way, in a positive way, in a way that is loving, while sharing the truth. Not in this like stand on the side of the road and just scream and yell that everything's going wrong. Like that doesn't help anyone. So I would say my experience is a bit different than yours. But as far as the how we address or speak to like what you're saying here, like I'm just like, yeah, maybe ARPA likes it, but it's not for me. Like it's not my thing. I think there's a certain degree of truth to that in the sense of, hey, not everybody's expected to be involved in every part of society, right? Like there is good work being done for, I mentioned Cyrus Center. I'm like, that's great work. But I don't have capacity, skills, gifts to get directly involved in that work. Maybe we can give a donation once a year, but that's the extent of it.
Yeah.
I don't think I wouldn't expect to be judged for that by somebody who was very passionate about helping youth who were disenfranchised in our city. Like, I think that's great, but I just don't have the same capacity as you to do that. I think when it comes to politics, for all things, we need to go back to God's word. Like, what does God say in his word about Christians and what we ought to or ought not to do? So I referenced already Jeremiah 29:7, where it talks about get involved in the affairs of the city. So that God is not saying through Jeremiah and also to us, that's why it's included in God's word. He's not saying, hey, if you like it or if you're interested, like maybe get involved. He's like, no, get involved. It's not a suggestion. It's a command. Jump into the New Testament. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount talks about being a salt and light. He doesn't say, be a salt and light if you see results. If you don't, just forget about it. Like, we have to be a salt and light all the time. Mm-hmm. And this doesn't come into play just with politics, right? I think of missionary efforts, whether they're overseas or local. How many missionaries and urban missionaries and evangelists haven't grappled with like, wow, like God's not blessing this. Like there's like the church membership's not growing. People don't seem to be hearing the word. There's no fruit, right? They ultimately need to remind themselves, as we often do in politics, why do we do this work? We don't do it because God has said, if you do this work, this and this and this is all going to happen. He said, do this work because I said, do this work. So out of a sense of obedience, right? That's why we do this work. Take parenting. We don't parent our children only if we know that our kids are going to grow up and it's all going to work out wonderfully. Yeah. Like, we parent them regardless. Yeah. Right. And it's the same is true on the flip side, right? If, you have 2 young children, if in 20 years, those children have married and they've accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior and they're raising children, it's like, wow, that's great. But you can't be like, oh no, it's all my doing. Like, I did such a great job. And in the same way, if 1 or 2 of them didn't accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior and took a different path, you can't blame that on yourself either, right? So I think that this sense of obedience, regardless of what the outcome might be, we still have to do it. Now, that doesn't mean we're irresponsible or flippant about the work. I mean, we need to be strategic. We need to think things through and try our best to use the talents God has given us for his glory and to grow those talents for sure. But that's not ultimately the reason why we do it, because of that promise. Yeah. We do it because of a sense of obedience. Yeah.
I think it's a great answer, even probably more, or at least my experience, more for when you're feeling down and dejected about like, hey, this work isn't like getting anything, but just to be like, hey, I'm not here because for the results, but here because of obedience to Christ. Is that your own experience as well? I mean, you've been doing this work for a long time. You must have had days or weeks or years where you were just like, man, what am I doing here? Yeah. Like, what's helped you in those times to keep going?
Yeah. Well, so God's word has, just going back to God's word and reminding myself of those truths and his steadfast love. But then also other people who God places on your path at the right time to encourage you to keep going. But you're right. It definitely is. There is times like that. And in fact, that was probably one of the biggest adjustments for me, going from working in the greenhouse to doing this work. Like, it's very long road. It can take years to make even small little changes, where in the greenhouse, every day at the end of the day, you could see evidence of your work, right? Like, you could see it easily, and it was very fulfilling in a sense. So fulfillment and job satisfaction comes in a bit of a different way. But I think that's okay. Like, it's okay to have a bit more moderated expectations about what is God going to do with this effort or that effort. And then the wonderful part of it is sometimes he blesses it just with huge fruit. And that's just, we really celebrate those types of victories.
So you've been full-time since 2012, 2014?
2012. Yeah.
What have been, so that's a lot, that's over 10 years now. Like, what have been the big fruits that you've seen from this work? Like, where has the needle really moved in the positive direction for the changes that ARPA is, fighting for?
Yeah. So I can think of 3 examples, pretty just off the top of my head. So when we started this work in 2012, a huge part of our work was working just with Canadians and helping them, trying to get them to understand there's no abortion law, et cetera. But then a part of our work was directly with lawmakers. So in 2015, there was an election. A new group of MPs came in, and we had identified a few of them as pro-life. We had already kind of reached out to them. And then one of them reached out back to us, MP Kathy Wagenthal from Saskatchewan, and said, hey, I have an opportunity to put forward a private member's bill. I'd like to work with you on which one to put forward. So I had that opportunity to work with her in putting forward a piece of legislation that would, in that case, protect preborn victims of crime. So we don't have to get into maybe all the nuances, but Canada's like so far out of line with other countries that even when a woman chooses to carry her child to term, and somebody through some kind of criminal act against her harms her or kills her child.
Like punches her in the stomach or something.
Yeah. Like that child then is not recognized as a victim.
Wow.
Yeah. So the person in this, there was an example of this in 2014, and that's what motivated MP Kathy Wagenthal to want to put this forward where that tragedy had happened. So anyway, that was a highlight. And then to be in the House of Commons when the bill was voted on with the family of the woman who had been killed along with her preborn child, that was, just pretty huge in the sense of, hey, the bill didn't pass, but be encouraged. Like, look at all the relationships that got developed here. Look at how much Canadians got educated as to, like what I said, how far out of line we were and so on. So that's one example. Another example is in 2022, had the opportunity to work with MP Ed Fast from neighboring riding here in Abbotsford on a bill that would essentially have stopped the slippery slope of euthanasia in our country. So I'm not sure if your viewers or listeners are aware, but Canada right now has the most extreme euthanasia regime in the world.
Wow.
And that's happened only since 2016. So in 9 years, we've gone from a complete prohibition on euthanasia and assisted suicide to now almost very close to allowing it for people with mental illness as the sole underlying condition. So that component, mental illness, was what is called a sunset clause in the law. So the last bill that the Liberals put forward, it expanded it, and then it included this sunset clause, and it said euthanasia, and just speaking in layman's terms, euthanasia is not allowed for people with mental illness as a sole underlying condition until 2027. At that time, it will become legal. So Ed Fast put forward a bill to repeal that, and I should back up. At the time, it said 2024. So okay. Going back, the sunset clause said 2024. Ed Fast, we worked with him to put forward a bill to repeal that. Now, his bill didn't pass, but it got support from like 8 Liberal MPs, so from the government's own party, the entire NDP caucus, and the entire Conservative caucus. So it's only because the rest of the Liberals and the Bloc voted against it that it didn't pass. So it got very close. And within 2 days, the Liberals themselves had essentially put forward the same bill. So this is politics, right? They didn't want to be seen to support an opposition bill, but they knew that this bill made sense and Canadians supported it. So within a couple of days, they put forward their own bill and delayed that sunset clause to 2027, knowing that an election was going to happen in between and they wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. So that was a huge success for us because we were able to work along with lots of other groups and then Ed Fast to stop that slippery slope. So that was fruit, if you will. We're always looking for fruit on our work. And then the last quick example is a neighboring province in Alberta. So we've been working on medical transitions for minors and how provincial governments, because they have jurisdiction over healthcare, they have a responsibility to protect 13, 14, 15-year-olds who are experiencing gender dysphoria from being encouraged to take puberty blocking medication, cross hormone therapy, and even surgery to transition from one gender to the other. Like these are children, right? They can't go to the liquor store and buy beer because they're too young to make those decisions. But in Canada, those children could make those decisions and were. So we initiated, it's called the Let Kids Be campaign, Stop Medical Transitions for Minors. Began working in the various provinces. And then very quickly after that, Danielle Smith, the premier in Alberta, introduced legislation to that very effect. Now, granted, it's not just because of the work of ARPA. There were a lot of other Christian organizations and completely agnostic individuals and organizations who also saw the ridiculousness of what was going on when it came to how we were supposed to be helping minors. So that was just encouraging to work with all of those types of people and then see that fruit. And this past fall, Alberta did pass 3 types of legislation that, for example, kids can't go to school and just change their pronouns and their names without their parents' consent. No more puberty blocking, cross-hormone therapy until you're of age in that province. So that's just really encouraging to see that fruit. Yeah. Yeah.
So you're working directly with politicians to try to like engage them and change their minds on things. But I feel like the real power is with the people, the people that vote them in.
Yeah.
And they get influenced heavily by the media. And I feel like a lot of the media pushes certain narratives that are pro these things or withhold certain information about the damages that these things cause. How do you fight that? Like, how do you get the message out in a way that reaches Canadians, and so they would vote differently, and so they understand? Like I would say, most Canadians are against abortion, or at least certain levels are against it, even though we have no laws against it.
Yeah.
Most Canadians are against, the issue you just talked about in Alberta. But it seems like the media never shows any of that, and because of that, they're voting a certain way.
Yeah.
How do you fight that? How do you reach the people when you have just very powerful entities of media giving a whole different message?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, so the first thing I would say is when it comes specifically to voting, like Canadian citizens and how they vote at the various levels, we get involved with that, but mostly just informing. So, for example, right now there's a by-election here in Chilliwack for school board. So the local ARPA chapter solicited some feedback from the candidates and now is distributing that material just to help people make a good decision. So ARPA is strictly nonpartisan. So what that means is that we don't promote any candidate or party, and we don't oppose directly any candidate or party. And we do that because we're in the business of relationship building. Right. So, for example, Lori Thronis and Katie Bartel are running here in Chilliwack, and one other fellow, Shane Koyman. If we would come out and endorse one of them, but that person didn't get in and the other person did, that they wouldn't want to meet with us. Yeah. So like, you're the ones that endorsed my opponent. Like, I'm not going to meet with you guys. Yeah. So because we're in the business of that relationship building, we're strictly nonpartisan. So just so your viewers and yourself are aware of that. But when it comes to how to get that message out, I think that's where technology has really helped, not so much just social media, but using mailing lists, SEO generation, advertising, these kind of things, that has really helped. But then a lot of it still is the traditional printing pamphlets and encouraging these local ARPA chapters to have a Saturday morning distribution where they'll get like 15 people together, grab 3,000 flyers and hit neighborhoods. Right. One Saturday morning every month. So just getting it out, actually like hand delivering it to places. And then another one is to use the advertising methods like on transit buses, billboards in cities. So for example, 2018, we ran a cross country billboard effort. All it said was Canada has no abortion laws. That's all it said. Because we know that polling shows us that most Canadians think there is. Like most Canadians you walk up to on the street, they will be pro-choice. They'll be in favor of abortion. But they'll also think that it's only allowed in the first trimester. They won't be aware that there's no legislation. So that campaign was opposed vigorously by the pro-abortion side, so much so that they tried to get Ad Standards Canada to shut those ads down. But that's because they didn't want the truth to come out. Yeah. This ties back to that issue we talked about earlier, censorship, right? They didn't want that issue to come out and Canadians to be aware of that. Currently, right now, on the medical transitioning for minors, those Let Kids Be, those ads are on buses in Calgary and in London, and there's other groups across the country talking about putting them out more. And that, like especially in Ontario, is having a huge impact. All the media has covered it there. There's an election campaign there right now, right? So the candidates are being forced to talk about it. So that, in those ways, is trying to change the narrative, if you will, trying to shift the narrative a little bit. But you're right, it is. When the mainstream media, for sure, they're not on our side when it comes to these things. They will cover it from time to time and include a comment here or there from us, but there's always some spin on it. Yeah.
So you said your budget right now for ARPA is $2 million.
Just shy of
if
$2
you
million.
got someone wrote you a check for $20 million, what difference would that make?
I think, just building backwards from what we were just talking about, it certainly would assist us in being more aggressive with those kind of advertising campaigns. So that's a big part of it. We see the value in that, some of the metrics are just media hits, responses to our organization, and then also responses favorably. So people will come to those websites and then order materials. They're like, I never knew about this. Give me some postcards, give me some brochures. I'll hand them out in my neighborhood, that kind of thing. So that could be multiplied, obviously, in a big way with that kind of money. And then I think another part of it would be a few more staff. I'm always amazed when we put out a job description for an opening, how many people apply. I think it's fascinating that there's people who want to make working in a political advocacy organization a career. Yeah. And that's what we present to them, a career opportunity. So that's really encouraging. So we're not covering all areas of the country for sure. And it's helpful when we have people like here in BC, because we have staff here, we can naturally build that relationship with MLAs here in the province. It's harder to do when you don't have full-time people in like Saskatchewan, Manitoba. We have only one in Alberta right now. So we could expand our network, if you will, of people working full-time at building those relationships and then being closer to the people on the ground as far as the grassroots side of the work goes. So those would be two big ways that we could seriously improve what we're doing is so far as advancing the mission of the organization.
Yeah. You talked about how God's been working in your life and then it went through hardship as well. And you lost your son, Markus, to cancer, I think when he was 18.
Yeah.
How did that impact you and let me share that story.
Yeah. I think, we've been talking a lot about the work of ARPA and I'm clearly very passionate about protecting vulnerable people. Right now in Canada, there are a lot of people who are suffering. And now one of the legitimate and legal responses to that is, well, we can just end it by ending your life instead of treating the symptoms. Up until 2021, that issue, euthanasia, was kind of a cerebral issue for me. Like I'd never been really close to anybody who had suffered and died. I had grandparents who had passed away and a friend of my wife had passed away. So somewhat close to that, but it was more just thinking about it from a policy perspective. And then that's when that changed in 2021 when Markus was diagnosed with cancer. And it was terminal cancer. They tried their best to treat it and we kind of gave it everything that was available. But
what was that like as a dad? You get told that your 18-year-old has terminal cancer. Like, how do you process that? How did you process
that? So I processed it actually by just reminding myself again of God's word. And I vividly remember the first evening, kind of where we were it was all sinking in. Marcus's friends came over. I think maybe one of his sets of grandparents or so was over. And we really had to remind ourselves that at that time, and still today, for the most part, we don't know why God visited that suffering on our family. The only response that we could have was that through it, we had to work to grow closer to God, not farther away from him. Like that has to be our focus. That through this suffering, God is glorified and we grow closer to him through it. And I think that perspective just really carried us through
that was a conscious thought then already?
Yeah. Because I have vivid recollection of saying to his buddies at the time who were there at our house, I said to them, I said that we don't know why God has brought this upon us, why your good friend has cancer. But I said, we need to approach this in such a way that 20 years from now, that you guys are able to look back on this experience as something that brought you closer to God, not separated you from God. That's how we have to approach this. We have to live through this. So that's how we started. But then through the journey, an incredible amount of what I call wrestling with the sovereignty of God. Like God is sovereign.
And nothing happens. God being that he predetermines all things.
And nothing happens without his awareness. I think of the whole story of Job in the Bible, like how God himself doesn't inflict suffering on us, but he allows it to happen in his sovereignty. So the scene in the New Testament where Jesus was walking with his disciples and they came upon that fellow who was blind. And then his disciples asked him, they're like, why is this man blind? Is it because he sinned or because his parents sinned? And Jesus is like, neither. Like, he's blind so that my Father is glorified. And then he healed him, right? So this understanding that Markus has cancer, it's not because he's a bad person or he sinned a certain way and that's what, that's his punishment. It's not because our family is not living rightly and that's the punishment. It's so that my name is glorified in how you respond to this suffering. And I think of all the people who embodied that the best, it was actually Markus. Like, his disposition towards receiving that terminal diagnosis and going through, 12 months of hardcore chemo treatments, operations, radiation, hospital visit after hospital visit, how he took it all in stride and had that eternal perspective. It was just, I remember once sitting in the hot tub with him. So this is just as an aside, we, as a family, we had a savings fund for a hot tub, and then Markus was diagnosed, and some of our family members said, you know what, we're going to chip in so that you have enough and get a hot tub, because Markus loved sitting in the hot tub, and he spent a lot of time in there with his buddies and so on. And one time we were sitting in there, and he was talking about, he's like, when I get to buy a house, I want to buy a house out in like Agassiz, Rosedale. He said, I said, oh, why? He said, oh, I just love looking at Mount Chem. That's so fun. And then I said to him, I'm like, son, that might be that you don't ever come to this point in your life. He's like, oh, I know, Dad, I know, but it's good to sometimes just think about it, Like, he helped us get through that. Because he, at such a young age, was able to wrestle with God's sovereignty and accept that, I don't know why, but I know that God is in control, and that through my suffering, I need to just hang on to him, stay close to him. And I think that God used, obviously, other people around us in our closer circle to emphasize that, but he also used people that we wouldn't have expected. So his doctor, his oncologist, Dr. Rod, so this is 13 months or so into the treatment, we had to sit down because we had another scan, and he's like, there's nothing more we can do. And we kind of expected, like, we were prepared for that, but then we weren't really prepared for what happened next in the conversation, because Markus said to him, he looked at him, he's like, hey, doc, he's like, so how much time do I have? Like, he's just really nonchalant. Like, how much time do I have? And the doctor, who's agnostic, I would say, he's not Christian, he said, Markus, he's like, we don't know how much time you have, but what we do know is that every day you do have, we're going to help you live it the best you can. And I think that's how we started the journey, like 12, 13 months prior to that. That's how the entire like hospice and palliative portion of his journey was, because that was the perspective, even from the medical team. That was just huge in helping us get to the end. And, just praise God that God can use even people like Dr. Rod, not only for his incredible medical knowledge and abilities, but also just for a simple statement like that.
Encouragement.
Like, that was just huge for us. So end of life care all of a sudden, and euthanasia and palliative care and suicide and all that, assisted suicide, just became a huge part of our own personal journey.
Was it being offered to you, Markus?
No, it wasn't being offered. But as I was saying before, like, working at this from a policy level is one thing, but then actually walking a journey of suffering where, I'll be honest with you, like, when people are suffering and have a terminal disease, there's times when they do say, like, I want to die. Like, I remember it was a week or two before Markus passed away, we would do devotions with him every night. And then I would say to him, oh, see you in the morning, unless Jesus comes back. And he would be like, oh, that'd be nice. Like, when you're suffering, of course you want the suffering to be over.
Yeah.
But now we live in a world where it's like, oh, okay, well, we can schedule that tomorrow. Right. So Markus never expressed a desire for euthanasia or assisted suicide. All his treatments were actually in the Children's Hospital and then at Canuck Place Hospice, excuse me, which is a children's hospice. So it wasn't an option. Like, it's not legal right now in Canada for anyone under 18. Yeah. So that wasn't a huge part, but what was a big part was just a realization that there's a whole other side of the euthanasia debate in Canada than just what the policy says or what the law says. Like, there's people living through this all the time. And if you don't have the right perspective, then it's pretty easy to come to the conclusion that, oh, yeah, I'd rather die than go through this, for sure. So coming out of that, it was just a real eye-opener for our family that, oh, what we all just went through is actually intimately connected with the issues that Dad is working on, that I'm working on. And even Markus realized that. It was in April, so about 6 weeks before he passed away. And ARPA, I was working at the time, but I didn't have full attention to it. But anyway, they sent out a memo saying, hey, the government is reviewing our euthanasia laws and are welcoming submissions. So if you have a perspective, a story, send it in. And so as a family, we talked about that, and we sent in a submission sharing a bit about our journey and how it was so encouraging that Markus was getting good palliative care and he was suffering well as you can. Anyway, there's more to it. And we sent that in to this committee of senators and MPs. And he said at that time, he's like, Dad, I can see how what we're going through is connected to your work. He's like, if you can use our story to change things, like, you go ahead, like, use our story. So that was just really neat to hear from his mouth, but also gives me confidence now in sharing it and where I share it and so on. So anyway, we had sent that in April of 2022. And then in November of 2022, that same committee, they responded to the email. Like, it was just like we had emailed them, they responded, but it was like 7 or 8 months later. And it said, we've read your story and we're inviting you to come to Ottawa and share it with the committee on this date. It was like the next week. So this was all still pretty fresh for us.
And Markus had already passed.
Markus had passed away in May. And, but again, it was one of those opportunities where it's like, you don't want to, you want to flee from it, but should you? So we said yes. I was like,
why did you want to flee from that, sharing that story?
Just because, so I think because we knew it was going to be really, really hard to share all that personal stuff, which was obviously, it would all go everywhere. It's out there for public consumption now. And I think for my wife, Jennifer, that's like, she's not as inclined as I am to obviously speak publicly and be out there in the open. But I remember getting the email, and then I went upstairs and I said, hey, there's an email, like, did you see it? And she's like, no, I shared with her. And she's like, oh, so when are we going? And like, so she just like, she embraced it right away. I mean, there was definitely moments throughout it where we're like, what are we doing? Why did we do this? But anyway, God gave us the strength, and people were praying for us right across the country, and we felt that. And so we shared the story with that committee on why euthanasia should not be expanded to minors in our country. And a lot of it had to do with that perspective, because we said to the committee, if Dr. Rod at that time had responded to Markus's question, how long do I have, with, we don't know, but this kind of cancer is pretty terrible. Like, it's not going to be fun. Like, there's going to be a lot of hard days, and you're essentially going to die because you're going to drown. Your lungs are going to fill with tumors. That perspective would have led to despair, right? And a serious challenge at finding any purpose in the suffering. And I think that, so that story, that experience that God led us through actually helped us become better ambassadors for that relationship building exercise and the policy requests that we would have to limit euthanasia, because you can die well in our country.
So my question is, have you thought or asked God, like, couldn't you have taught me this in a way that made me not lose my son?
Yeah. Definitely, but we don't dwell. We have to push ourselves not to dwell there.
Like, have you had like mourning, losing your son? Like that's one of the worst pains. I think they say there's no name for it, right? There's a name for orphans, and there's a name for like losing your wife or your husband. There's no name for losing your kids. Like it's one of the most painful things you can go through. Did you have anger? Did it take a while to process, or were you able to really give it over consistently through it all? Like how did you move forward?
Yeah, I think there was definitely different phases of response. The anger, I can honestly say we never had anger. Markus was sad, deeply grieved that like he knew his life wasn't going to be very long, but he never shook his fist at God. Like he was never angry at God. And that we actually see as a small mercy of God. Near the beginning.
Gift.
Yeah, totally. Like near the beginning of this, one of the verses we read was from Psalm 57, oh God, be merciful, oh God. And we prayed like, God, be merciful on Markus, like that this wouldn't be as bad as they might think it is in the initial stages, that even though it is bad, that they can treat it. But now when we look back, we're like, yeah, God was merciful. Not in all the same ways that we would have wanted him to be merciful, but he was merciful. And one of those ways was that while we're wrestling through this illness with Markus, we weren't also wrestling with the spiritual side of it, where Markus was doubting or angry or rejecting God. Like how could a good God bring some kind of evil like this into anyone's life? No, he didn't. So that was huge. I think that the thoughts that you expressed earlier, definitely they bounce around in our heads still sometimes today, right? And I think probably the easiest one to come in your mind is like, why did we need that? Like those people need that, or those people, like we don't need that. Like look at their life, like so, and that's just really, really bad. Like it's like we have to check ourselves really quickly. Yeah. That's not the right response. Like we need to have a posture of humility and submission to God, that in his sovereignty, he thought this was what we needed at this time. He allowed this to happen. And
so, as you say, it's not the right response, and I would agree with that, like theologically. But when someone's in that suffering, like it still is sometimes the response you have. Like it's the reality of like your heart, and your reaction to it.
Yeah, I think those why questions definitely came up, and we allowed them to come up. It's not like we
suppressed them.
No, we didn't suppress them, but we had to. And I think we're mostly successful in pivoting pretty quickly. Yeah. Like we can't dwell on the why because we're probably not going to get an answer. Yeah. And that's just going to lead to more frustration and despair as we move forward. Yeah. Right.
I've suffered myself in different ways, and I've met a lot of other people that have suffered and had some real conversations with them. And I would say your perspective is unique, that your ability to pivot on those things quickly, or however you want to word that, is an awesome gift. Like it's really beautiful to hear that. Is that something that was just a gift that you feel it was given to you? Was it something that was a theology that you were taught? Was there something else that happened in your life earlier that made you aware of this, and so you had the knowledge to say, no, I need to put my faith in God here and trust in him, even though I don't understand the why? And
yeah, I think I would say it's all God for sure. Like it's I praise God, I thank God for allowing us to go through that that fire and not be burned, as he says in Isaiah. Like I'll bring you through the fire, but you won't be burned. I think that's huge. Theology definitely, plays into it in the sense of, how do I phrase this? Like we talked about God's sovereignty. So that obviously is a theological concept coming out of God's word, that God is sovereign. But then also the eternal perspective, right? Like I read like 1 Thessalonians 4, where Paul talks about, those who have gone before will rise up from the graves, meet Jesus in the air, and then we will rise and meet with them. Right. And I'm like, I can't wait for that day. Like sometimes when I go to the cemetery to Markus's grave, I long to hear the sound of the trumpet and then see Jesus coming back like that. So that part theology does. I brought a book along, I could share with you after, by Alistair Begg. It's called Brave by Faith. So he wrote that book, and a lot of it's connected to COVID. But in it, he talks about how we have to be rooted in God's word so that when a crisis comes, we know how to respond based on our convictions that are deeply rooted in God's word. So as I grew up, it was always instilled in me that's important, that we read God's word. When we listen to sermons, we grapple with them, we talk about them, how are we going to use this week, that kind of thing. And I think that through God's grace and working in our lives as a family, we're rooted in God's word. So when this crisis came, Markus is diagnosed with cancer, God held on to us. He didn't allow us to blow around, being tossed around, not knowing what to do. Yeah. We know what we have to do. We have to go to God's word. He says, those who come near to me, I will be near to them. Well, do we believe that? Now's when rubber hits the road. Yeah. Right. So, and that's why back to, Markus saying you can share this story. I think God uses the life experiences that he's given us, not so that we can just bottle them up and put them away and never talk about them, but so that we can ourselves allow that to be part of our story and then share that with other people. Because the sharing of our stories and how God has worked in our lives has a huge impact. When we can witness to God's working in our life, that can change other people's hearts and minds. And they might not have the same experience, but because you've shared it, they have just a little bit more of a sense of how it works when all this stuff you read about and study as doctrine and words on pages, how does that play out in day-to-day life, in the good, the bad, the ugly of how we live our lives? And, I know you've experienced that in different ways. Lots of people have experienced that in different ways. And I'm always encouraged when people share something of those experiences to bless others, to help others, to cause other people to think about it. And then I think that you asked about, other things in your life. I don't always right away see the connection, but so this was in 2021 that Markus was diagnosed. In 2017, I almost got killed. I'm an avid cyclist. I love cycling. And I was cycling up in northern BC and I got hit by a truck when I was cycling. And I have no recollection of the accident. I woke up when I was being put into an ambulance. And my wife, Jennifer, was there. That she had come, lots of stuff had transpired when I was out and have no recollection. But she told me what happened. And the first things I said to her were, wow, I almost died. And then she's like, yeah. And I'm like, I'm okay with that. I just had this sense of peace that if God called me, I'm ready. I want Jesus to come back. And I think we have to live our lives that way, especially as God's people. And we have to not just have that perspective within us. We need to kind of allow that to shine forth in how we live. Live it out, yeah. Right? Like James says, don't pray you're going to do this, and this. God's will, by God's will alone, will you do these things. Yeah. And when you go through times in life where, you might be I often think of the river. We live by the Vetter, and the river has all these twists and turns. You have to be prepared for that. And to be prepared, you got to be steeped in God's word. You got to be rooted in God's word. Yeah.
Being in God's word, is that something that you have done from a young age already? Like just daily devotionals? What is your routine in taking time for getting to know him and his word?
Yeah, I think for a lot of years now, it's been the same, but it wasn't always. So earlier we talked about a bit of our journey. And then when we moved to Surrey and in that new church community, that's when I really made my faith my own, in a sense. And then I think shortly after that is when I started to develop really just solid habits, if you will, So I'm quite a routine kind of person, especially in the morning.
Yeah.
I love my morning time. So yeah, I always wake up and I need to spend time with God and his word first.
Yeah.
I do have a coffee at the same time. So that's my one vice, but no, like our family has developed a habit of phones go in a certain place in the kitchen, no phones in bedrooms. And we really, I do that myself, but I really encourage my children to do that. Like, don't go look at your phone first thing in the morning. Open the Bible and at least spend some time reading some verses, meditating on that, praying it. Yeah. Because as soon as you get distracted by your phone, then you're not thinking about it anymore.
You think back of Markus, we talked about his cancer and his response to it, stuff like that. But he's not defined by his sickness. Mm-hmm. What are some of your favorite memories of your son?
Oh, so Markus he was an entrepreneur at heart. Like he really, from quite a young age already, he wanted to be a business person. Yeah. And we still today sometimes find piece of paper or a piece of cardboard laying around with some chicken scratch of his on it. Like he had a little business plan he sketched out with some numbers and so on. And he just had a mind for that. Like, how do you take something small and grow it and add things to it and then let it become self-sustaining and then go on to the next thing. And it's, we have a mutual friend in Gary Bars. You have him on the show often. And I think that's why Markus and Gary clicked so well. Like they just were very similar in that way, like that real entrepreneurial mindset. So some of my favorite memories with Markus were actually before he was diagnosed. It started in his shoulder and it was, he thought it was an injury from the gym. Like he had been going to the gym with his buddies. So he was working through that and seeing physio and stuff. But at the same time, he was getting ready for graduating and he was going to launch a little landscape business. That was going to be his first kind of endeavor. So he had his friend over, James, and they were working on his trailer, building some like custom hooks in it for his weed eaters and little things on the floor to stop his lawnmower and stuff. And he just, all these little things like he had a vision for and he knew who to bring in and help him do these things. And so just a real gift for that forward thinking that I just really appreciate. And that comes to mind most often, not just for myself, but for our family. These days when things happen, we're like, oh, Markus would have thought this was so cool, like that kind of thing. But then I think the other part, and this is where I didn't always have a front row seat to seeing, but in conversations with his friends and now as time moves on, more of those types of conversations, Markus was just a real, like kind of like a leveling factor in the friend group in the sense of he was willing to call things out. He was willing to say like, what are you doing? Like, that's not what we do. Like, that's ridiculous. You can't act like that. You can't live like that. Like he was the one who would kind of, I don't know, today you hear that term accountability partner, but like he would be a really good accountability partner just because he was,
real, correct.
Yeah. Just real. Not like no nonsense. Like he loved to have fun. And I still find videos of him, him and his buddies doing burnouts in Sumas Prairie or just doing silly things like that or whatever. Like he would have fun. But when it came to like the real stuff in life, he was like, no, like it's real. And I think that just got better and better for him as his disease progressed. Yeah. Like where all his friends, like they took his words seriously. Like here's our buddy, like he's dying. And this is his perspective. Like we need to learn from this. This is, and that continued right to the very last day, like the very last Saturday. So that full day that he was alive, all his buddies came to the hospice to visit him. And, it's pretty something. It's quite something. Just he was able to share with them, like just real. Even Gary Murray came, and he just kind of had these like words of wisdom. I remember saying to him like, "Oh, his grandparents were coming, and like, oh, do you have some words for them?" He's like, "Oh, Spirit will give me something." Like he just was so at peace with. Like he was just like, "I'm going to see Jesus." Like. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. I think what you said earlier about the fact that this isn't the end. right? Like he is with Christ now, and as all believers are, and will be, and that this world is not our home. Which is easy, especially I think in Western culture with the riches we have and the comforts we have, that we try to make this our own. But it's temporary.
Yeah.
Okay, so switching gears, you brought a bunch of books. Talk to me about the books that you brought and why you brought them.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I thought of it this morning when I was getting ready. So one of them is Our God Moves Mountains. So this is a book written by Mark Penninga. He's the former executive director of ARPA Canada. And I'm giving this one to you because it tells the story of ARPA. Okay. Like how did ARPA come to be? What has God been doing? How have mountains been moved? What are some examples of that? And I think it just the way that Mark writes it in the narrative is just easy to read. Right. And I think that you'll quite enjoy it. So this one's for you.
Thank you.
I don't sign books, so I'm not signing it, and I didn't write it. So this one here is a book it's called God and Government by Cornelius Van Dam. So he was a professor at a Reformed seminary in Hamilton, Ontario. But this book has been very formative for us, for ARPA, for myself, in just getting a good understanding of things like what's it like to live in a country and serve a government that allows evil to still happen. Like, should we be okay with that? Should we expect the government to outlaw all evil? Is it the government's role to ensure that people serve God and no other gods? Or is that something for the church? What does it mean to live in a pluralist society? And what kind of expectations should we have? Things like that. So this book has just been really helpful for that. He has a lot of kind of overarching those kind of themes, but then he digs into some issues like life and death, freedom, those issues that we talked about earlier. So just a really good one. I talked about this one briefly. Bought this book coming out of COVID by Alistair Begg, Brave by Faith. Again, this book's been just really helpful for me to understand conviction, the importance of conviction. And I think, you've probably experienced that too in COVID, especially when it came to the church's response to COVID and what to do and what not to do. There's a certain tolerance amongst most Canadians, most people have just some common sense that, hey, we're not always all going to think the same, and that's okay. We have to be okay with that. But I think what we saw during COVID was that people didn't actually know where they stood. Yeah. And they were really just blown around all over the place. Right. So he uses the book of Daniel as a kind of a launching pad for what he writes here. And I'm always fascinated. And sometimes we forget how, when Daniel and his friends were living in Babylon as exiles, they also tolerated quite a bit. Right. The king came to them and said, you're going to have different names. And they're like, okay. And you're going to go to school and you're going to learn all our stuff. Like, you're not going to learn your stuff. Okay. They did. They went along with it. And then they said, no, you're going to eat this food, not that food. And that was their line. They're like, no, we're not. And I like, it's so impactful, right? The other story of Daniel where, his friends were thrown into the fire, and that little phrase, even if our God doesn't rescue us, we know that this is in his control and he is God, right? So I'm like, that kind of confidence, I think. So Begg does a really good job of talking about that. Yeah. And then the other two you might find interesting because of the coaching work you do. I don't know if you've seen these two books by Peter Greer,
I have not, no.
But they're fascinating. So Mission Drift and Spiritual Danger of Doing Good these are mandatory readings for us at ARPA Canada for board and staff. But just really powerful experiences that Peter Greer has had, and then he relays them and connects them to biblical concepts on, if as an organization, this is your mission, how do you protect that? How do you decide 5 years, 10 years, 15 years that you're still on that mission and you haven't drifted far from it because of things you've done or not done? In fact, I'm reading a book just right now, just a short little book by David Green. He's the founder of Hobby Lobby in the States. And he writes about, not about this book, but he writes about how his company went through some mission drift. And often it's because of economic situations, right? So you talked about, well, what if you got $20 million? I think the biggest challenge with that is to not drift from your mission when you get that $20 million. Yeah. So David Green is talking about Hobby Lobby and how there was a real boom period where oil was flowing in the States, and there was a lot of money in the mid I think it was the early 80s. Yeah, and he talks about how their company then started selling all kinds of products that had nothing to do with the crafts that they had started with, the picture frames and so on. And he said it was like only when they came to the bust period where they're like, oh, wow, we're on the hook for all kinds of things that we didn't really even intend to sell. But we just thought, oh, let's pick them up because people are buying stuff. And so anyway, mission drift is a huge part of ARPA Canada. And I think one of the reasons why we've been around, like going into our 18th year now, is because the board has always been very cognizant of that and ensuring that when we put together our 1 year, 3 year strategic plans, that they're in accordance with our mission. Okay. And then Spiritual Danger of Doing Good is just it's a convicting book. Like, it's very humbling to read it, because when you read,
does that tie into our earlier conversation a little bit of caring for people, not just for 80 years, but for eternity?
A little bit, but more so in when you work in ministry or mission organizations like ARPA Canada, there can be a tendency to think that, well, because you're doing the Lord's work, like you can get away with more. You're somehow on a higher pedestal than other people. Okay. So pride is a huge thing. But he just gives like little examples. Like, so for example, one of them could be, you might be preparing a message to your donors, and the previous quarter, your revenue, say, was $180,000. But in your note to the donors, you're like, our revenue last quarter was almost $250,000. Right? Like how you can stretch the truth to make yourself look better than you actually are. Yeah. And just a really good reminder to like, no, that's not godly. It's certainly against the ninth commandment and lying. Like, let's not engage in that kind of thing as we go about executing our mission. Just be truthful with people. So anyway, those are two really good books. And yeah, I thought I can send you a link, or you can look them up.
Yeah,
but they're
I'll put in the
good
description
books.
of the video for if you guys want to look these books up. But,
yeah. Anyway, so I just brought a few of those along, just awesome books that have kind of made an impact on me among many other ones. But
thank you for that.
Yeah.
So what are the big things that ARPA is working on now moving forward, and how do people support the work that you're doing?
Yeah. I would say that probably the three issues that we've touched on a little bit are the biggest issues. So on the euthanasia file, as I shared earlier, it still is right now in the law that sunset clause will be removed in March of 2027. So that's something that has to be corrected by an incoming government. And it looks like we're going to probably have an election this spring. The polls are shifting a bit here and there, but God willing, we'll have a government that is open or amenable to changing that. But then we don't want to just stop there. Right now in Canada, disabled people, for example, are allowed to request euthanasia just because they're disabled.
So if you're disabled, would be like you're in a wheelchair?
Yeah.
So if you're in a wheelchair and you can go to your doctor and say, give me a shot?
Yeah. So and to be clear, it's not like the next day. So there's a 2-track system in our country. So if you have a terminal illness, something like what Markus would have had, then usually within a day you can be euthanized. But if you're for something like a disability, or as we've seen in the news in recent times, homelessness or PTSD as a result of being in Canada's reserves or army, that kind of thing. So veterans have expressed that they've been suggested to consider euthanasia. Those kind of things, you're put on a 90-day track, it's called. So then you have to wait 3 months. So there is a waiting period there. So that's just good to clarify that. It's not like people are getting themselves euthanized the next day. But we want to push to roll that back, because sometimes people aren't quite, I think, understanding the gravity of this in this extent. So we talked about being in a wheelchair. So if I'm standing next to somebody, my friend who's in a chair, I have a friend in a chair, and if I express a desire to die and they look at me and they're like, you're a middle-aged, healthy guy. Like, I get suicide prevention. But if he says, my life sucks, I want to die, he gets suicide assistance. So why are we splitting people into protected and unprotected camps like that? Like, it's just really, really bad for humanity.
You're devaluing
exactly
them
Yeah. So anyway, to your question, one of the big things we're working on is trying to build support amongst people over like voters and so on, and those who make the laws, that we need to roll this back. Like the euthanasia regime is way too wide open in our country. And the numbers are growing in a staggeringly quick rate. Like since 2016, when it's been legalized, already over 60,000 people have requested and received euthanasia. So that's one. And then the other one is on the area of minors and gender ideology. So in SOGI 123, those kind of programs, and then, right down to the cross-hormone therapy, puberty blocking medication, right? And in this too, I sometimes describe it to people as it's a response that we're allowing to suffering, because I believe that gender dysphoria is a real condition. There are people, especially young people, who at times question their identity. I think we can't dispute that. But it's the response that's problematic, right? When a 12, 13, 14-year-old is having these feelings, and the people that he or she ought to look up to, right? Parental authority, government authority, medical authority, are all affirming that gender dysphoria and then encouraging these types of treatments, which are irreversible. So once a teen goes on puberty blocking medication, the chances are they are not going to be able to reproduce offspring at any stage of life. So these are hugely problematic, and I think it's sad that we're as a society allowing this to happen. So we're working at that at various levels. Sometimes it's municipal, sometimes it's provincial, and sometimes it's federal. And then the other one is the one that perhaps we talked about this earlier, but most passionate about is that still today in Canada, there's about 100,000 abortions every single year.
Crazy.
And
there's still no abortion law.
And there's no abortion
law.
What
other countries have no abortion laws?
So the only country, it's hard to exactly ascertain, but we think that North Korea is a country that has no abortion laws. China did for a long time, but it looks like there's some semblance of a sex-selective abortion law in there because of the ratio growing differential between males and females. But we know that Canada is the only democracy in the world with no legislation. And I think that one I'm particularly...
Well, how did we get to that point? How are we the country that's that liberal? Is it the people are really liberal? Is it why isn't it, I don't know, a European country? That would make more sense. Just they seem to be more liberal as a whole. Like how did Canada end up as being the only country? It just...
Yeah, I think it's safe to say there are European countries that are just as progressive or not more so than Canada. And they all have some type of legal framework in place, like prohibiting it after a certain stage or different requirements before you can actually secure an abortion, that kind of thing. So in Canada, very quickly, the history was, so as a country, we started in 1869. I think it was 1892 when we passed our first criminal code as a country. Prior to that, we relied on what came from the UK, from Britain. But it was prohibited. Abortion was completely prohibited until 1969. So 100 years after Confederation, that Pierre Trudeau was the prime minister. So Justin Trudeau's father was the prime minister at that time. And there was a bill put forward, an omnibus bill. So it contained all kinds of things. But part of that bill was that abortion would become legal if a woman made the request to what was called a therapeutic abortion committee. So that was a committee of 3 doctors, of which 2 had to say okay to the abortion. So from that time until 1988, that was the framework for abortion. But that was being constantly challenged in the courts, and then most famously by Henry Morgentaler, who he was setting up clinics where he wasn't abiding by that rule, and then he would get fined, put in prison, would go through the courts. Anyway, his engagement on that ended up in the Supreme Court in 1988. And the Supreme Court at that time, they ruled that the Therapeutic Abortion Committee was unconstitutional because there was unequal access from women across the country. So some women had to travel really, really far to go and make their request to that committee. Yeah. We didn't have the same technology as we do these days. And they said there has to be a way to make this more equal across the country. They opined in their decision that abortion should be illegal after a certain stage in the pregnancy. But they said, it's not our job to make that law. It's your job, Parliament. So make that law. So at the time, Brian Mulroney was the prime minister, and he made 2 attempts to pass a law. The second attempt to pass a law, an abortion law, so it wasn't a perfect abortion law, but it was an abortion law. It came into the Senate. So bills go through the House of Commons and then the Senate. And in the Senate, there was a tie vote on that bill. And the Speaker of the Senate had to cast the deciding vote, decided to vote against it. So the bill failed. But I think it's important that we recognize, and I've often shared this with people, I wasn't around then, so I can't fully comprehend the complexity of the situation. But pro-lifers and pro-choicers both worked against that bill. Pro-choicers because it's a woman's right to choose, so she should be able to do that for any or no reason. Pro-lifers because the bill wasn't perfect enough. And I think that's to our shame as a pro-life movement, that the status quo today is partially a result of pro-lifers working against that bill. Perfect. And because of that, Mulroney at the time is known to have said, like, I am never doing this again. I'm not putting forward anything. Both sides are at me, right? And that kind of has set the stage for subsequent prime ministers to just stay away from it. Like, we're not touching this. Like, it's politically a non-win situation. Yeah. So a lot of the work that we've been doing to get people to think, as I said earlier, in this incremental paradigm is so that politicians know, especially pro-life politicians, that if they go out on that proverbial branch to introduce something, even though it's not perfect, they need to know that it's not going to be both sides working to cut the branch off and leave them hanging, right? If you get what I mean.
Yeah.
So that's a huge part of our work. Right. So that always has a focus for us. It often has an outward expression. We really try to help people engage on this issue we talked earlier about how do we love people? How do we respect them? So one of the public demonstrations that we have is a flag display. So we have flag displays of 10,000, like little irrigation flags, or 100,000, and each flag then representing either 10 abortions or 1 abortion. And it's a very, like most people, when they see it for the first time, they're like, wow, this is so beautiful. I'm like, yeah, it's beautiful, but what it represents is something actually very unjust. And then we have these conversations, right? And that's been just a really good segue to building the relationships with average Canadians and getting that message out there.
Okay. Yeah. And how do people support ARPA? I mean, you have people that are actually working for ARPA, but like, how do a guy like me, I really enjoyed our conversation today. Like, how do, besides giving money, like what are some of the ways that we can support the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think a big part of our support comes through the connections that we have with people electronically. Like when I go to an area and introduce ARPA to people, there's a sense of optimism and excitement. And it's like, okay, this is great, but we need this to continue. And I can't be here every week to talk with you. So you got to sign up for our email list. Mm-hmm. We have a segmented email list. And I think perhaps one of the ones that's maybe most underrated is we put out a weekly prayer bulletin. Yeah. And that's like, I think we can't underestimate the power of prayer. And the more people that sign up for that and every day are remembering, we just give them little things to remember each day. That's huge for us.
I wrote it as we were talking. I said prayer or work harder. Which I think is, as Christians, it's sometimes easy to do, just to go try harder and work harder to fight for the causes that we believe are God's causes, and forget and neglect prayer. Yeah. So that's really cool that you do that.
Yeah. And then I think the second thing that you could do is start, like if you haven't already, continue if you have, but start building a relationship with the local town councillors here, the school board, your MLA, your MP. Just introduce yourself to them. You're somebody who votes for them. Let them know who you are, what you stand for, how you're supporting them. Let them know you're praying for them. Those kind of things, like that relationship stuff. When we look at how the left, the progressives, have moved things from unthinkable to now they're public policy in our country, it's not just because they got the number of votes in a legislature, in the House of Commons.
Grassroots.
It's grassroots. And most of the time because they were just regular people, right? So take take the LGBTQ community and the advocacy work they do. They've done a very good job at just being friendly neighbors to everybody, right? Showing up at the community events, putting on the community events, coming by on the Christmas parade to say hi, like all of that kind of stuff is relationship building.
It's funny how we can, as Christians, can learn so much from that.
Oh, yeah. I'll share just a quick anecdote with, so one of the MPs that we had the opportunity to work pretty closely along with was Mark Warawa. He's since passed away himself from cancer. But in 2016, there was a bill before the House of Commons that was seeking to add the words gender expression and gender identity to the Canadian Human Rights Code. And so this was obviously a part of the strategy of the LGBT movement to get everybody to really adopt the transgender ideology. It's the bill that famously Jordan Peterson spoke out against and kind of launched his career out of the University of Toronto. Anyway, at that time, Mark Warawa had a meeting from, I don't know if it was constituents or just somebody who met with him, and they were advocating to him to support the bill. And this family had a transgender child, and they just made the case, like, this is who we are, etc. And Mark told me once, he said that it was unbelievable how when he went into the House of Commons, how it actually became difficult to vote against the bill. He knew principally he had to, but because when he was doing so, he felt like he was voting against that family that he had just met. And that's understandable, but it shows, power. I share it because it shows the power of relationship, right? And I think that sometimes, getting back to what we chatted earlier a bit, sometimes Christians forget about that and they just want to blast truth from the side of the road and think that it's going to impact things, but you actually have to get in there.
People have to know you care.
Yeah.
You really genuinely care.
Totally.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah. It's been good.
Really enjoyed our chat. So if you guys want to support ARPA, what's the website?
Just ARPA Canada, ARPA Canada.ca.
Yeah. Sign up for the newsletter.
Yeah.
And thank you for the work you do.
Yeah. Thanks, Kyle.
You bet.